Hi, BookTube. Welcome to another Middlemarch meditation. When we last left off, we were with Dr. Lidgett, and he could not make up his mind how he was going to vote when the directors met to select the new hospital chaplain. The section we're going to read today is interesting because it's stage managed in a way by the narrator. They've made sure that for this meeting of the directors, both Dr. Lidgett and Mr. Bulstrode are going to arrive very late, but we, the readers, we're going to get a special treat, a sneak preview, a fly-on-the-wall view, if you like, of what was going on in the meeting while the other directors were waiting for Lidgett and Bulstrode to show up. And this is when we get to see the political divisions within Middlemarch, the political divisions that Lidgett has tried to keep himself innocent from. But really, I kind of wish he was at this earlier part of the meeting and had gotten to know the other directors better, to see exactly where all the differences of opinion are and what was behind them, what was the background to them for each individual. I think what I'm going to do with this section is read through the full text, all the pages we're covering today. And that's just because there's a lot of back and forth dialogue with new speakers coming in. And I just thought it's going to be difficult to remember who last spoke if I keep breaking up the reading to tell you about little things that I've noticed, all my little rabbit holes, the usual stuff. So we're going to start with a full read through of the whole section. And then afterwards, I will talk you through each page, some of the interesting things that are there, and additional facts, whatever they may be. So let's begin reading. Lidgett was late in setting out, but Dr. Sprague, the two other surgeons, and several of the directors had arrived early, Mr. Bulstrode, treasurer and chairman, being among those who were still absent. The conversation seemed to imply that the issue was problematical and that a majority for Tyke was not so certain as had been generally supposed. The two physicians, for a wonder, turned out to be unanimous, or rather, though of different minds, they concurred in action. Dr. Sprague, the rugged and weighty, was, as everyone had foreseen, an adherent of Mr. Fairbrother. The doctor was more than suspected of having no religion, but somehow Middlemarch tolerated this deficiency in him as if he had been a Lord Chancellor. Indeed, it is probable that his professional weight was the more believed in, the old world association of cleverness with the evil principle being still potent in the minds even of lady patients who had the strictest ideas of frilling and sentiment. It was perhaps this negation in the doctor which made his neighbours call him hard-headed and dry-witted, conditions of texture which were also held favourable to the storing of judgments connected with drugs. At all events, it is certain that if any medical man had come to Middlemarch with the reputation of having very definite religious views, of being given to prayer, and of otherwise showing an active piety, there would have been a general presumption against his medical skill. On this ground, it was, professionally speaking, fortunate for Dr. Minchin that his religious sympathies were of a general kind, and such as gave a distant medical sanction to all serious sentiment, whether of church or dissent, rather than any adhesion to particular tenets. If Mr. Bulstrode insisted, as he was apt to do, on the Lutheran doctrine of justification, as that by which a church must stand or fall, Dr. Minchin in return was quite sure that man was not a mere machine or a fortuitous conjunction of atoms. If Mrs. Wimple insisted on a particular providence in relation to her stomach complaint, Dr. Minchin, for his part, liked to keep the mental windows open and objected to fixed limits. If the Unitarian brewer jested about the Athanasian Creed, Dr. Minchin quoted Pope's Essay on Man. He objected to the rather free style of anecdote which Dr. Sprague indulged, preferring well-sanctioned quotations and liking refinement of all kinds. It was generally known that he had some kinship to a bishop and sometimes spent his holidays at the palace. Dr. Minchin was soft-handed, pale-complexioned, and of rounded outline, not to be distinguished from a mild clergyman in appearance, whereas Dr. Sprague was superfluously tall. His trousers got creased at the knees and showed an excess of boot, at a time when straps seemed necessary to any dignity of bearing. You heard him go in and out and up and down as if he had come to see after the roofing. In short, he had weight, and might be expected to grapple with a disease and throw it, while Dr. Minchin might be better able to detect it lurking and to circumvent it. They enjoyed about equally the mysterious privilege of medical reputation, and concealed with much etiquette their contempt for each other's skill. Regarding themselves as Middlemarch institutions, they were ready to combine against all innovators and against non-professionals given to interference. On this ground, they were both in their hearts equally averse to Mr. Bulstrode, though Dr. Minchin had never been in open hostility with him, and never differed from him without elaborate explanation to Mrs. Bulstrode, who had found that Dr. Minchin alone understood her constitution. A layman who pried into professional conduct of medical men, and was always obtruding his reforms, though he was less directly embarrassing to the two physicians than to the surgeon apothecaries who attended paupers by contract, was nevertheless offensive to the professional nostril as such, and Dr. Minchin shared fully in the new pique against Bulstrode, excited by his apparent determination to patronize Lidgett. The long-established practitioners, Mr. Wrench and Mr. Toller, were just now standing apart and having a friendly colloquy, in which they agreed that Lidgett was a Jackanapes, just made to serve Bulstrode's purpose. To non-medical friends, they had already concurred in praising the other young practitioner, who had come into the town on Mr. Peacock's retirement without further recommendation than his own merits and such argument for solid professional acquirement as might be gathered from his having apparently wasted no time on other branches of knowledge. It was clear that Lidgett, by not dispensing drugs, intended to cast imputations on his equals, and also to obscure the limit between his own rank as a general practitioner and that of the physicians who, in the interest of the profession, felt bound to maintain its various grades, especially against a man who had not been to either of the English universities and enjoyed the absence of anatomical and bedside study there, but came with a libellous pretension to experience in Edinburgh and Paris, where observation might be abundant indeed, but hardly sound. Thus it happened that on this occasion Bulstrode became identified with Lidgett and Lidgett with Tyke, and owing to this variety of interchangeable names for the chaplaincy question, divers minds were enabled to form the same judgment concerning it. Dr. Sprague said at once bluntly to the group assembled when he entered, "I go for Fairbrother, a salary with all my heart, but why take it from the vicar? He has none too much. He has to insure his life besides keeping house and doing a vicar's charities. Put £40 in his pocket and you'll do no harm. He's a good fellow, is Fairbrother, with as little of the parson about him as will serve to carry orders." "Ho, doctor," said old Mr. Powderwell, a retired ironmonger of some standing, his interjection being something between a laugh and a parliamentary disapproval. "We must let you have your say, but what we have to consider is not anybody's income, it's the souls of the poor sick people. Here Mr. Powderell's voice and face had a sincere pathos in them. He is a real gospel preacher, is Mr. Tyke. I should vote against my conscience if I voted against Mr. Tyke. I should indeed. Mr. Tyke's opponents have not asked anyone to vote against his conscience, I believe, said Mr. Hackbutt, a rich tanner of fluent speech, whose glimmering spectacles and erect hair were turned with some severity towards innocent Mr. Powderell. But in my judgment, it behooves us, as directors, to consider whether we will regard it as our whole business to carry out propositions emanating from a single quarter. Will any member of the committee aver that he would have entertained the idea of displacing the gentleman who has always discharged the function of chaplain here, if it had not been suggested to him by parties whose disposition it is to regard every institution of this town as a machinery for carrying out their own views? I tax no man's motives. Let them lie between himself and a higher power. But I do say that there are influences at work here which are incompatible with genuine independence, and that a crawling servility is usually dictated by circumstances which gentlemen so conducting themselves could not afford, either morally or financially, to avow. I myself am a layman, but I have given no inconsiderable attention to the divisions in the church, and oh, damn the divisions, burst in Mr. Frank Hawley, lawyer and town clerk, who rarely presented himself at the board, but now looked in hurriedly, whip in hand. We have nothing to do with them here. Fairbrother has been doing the work, what there was, without pay, and if pay is to be given, it should be given to him. I call it a confounded job to take the thing away from Fairbrother. I think it would be as well for gentlemen not to give their remarks a personal bearing, said Mr. Plymdale. I shall vote for the appointment of Mr. Tyke, but I should not have known, if Mr. Hackbutt hadn't hinted it, that I was a servile crawler. I disclaim any personality. I expressly said, if I may be allowed to repeat or even to conclude what I was about to say. Ah, here's Minchin, said Mr. Frank Hawley, at which everybody turned away from Mr. Hackbutt, leaving him to feel the uselessness of superior gifts in Middlemarch. Come, doctor, I must have you on the right side, eh? I hope so, said Dr. Minchin, nodding and shaking hands here and there, at whatever cost to my feelings. If there's any feeling here, it should be feeling for the man who is turned out, I think, said Mr. Frank Hawley. I confess I have feelings on the other side also. I have divided esteem, said Dr. Minchin, rubbing his hands. I consider Mr. Tyke an exemplary man, none more so, and I believe him to be proposed from unimpeachable motives. I, for my part, wish that I could give him my vote, but I am constrained to take a view of the case which gives the preponderance to Mr. Fairbrother's claims. He is an amiable man, an able preacher, and has been longer among us. Old Mr. Powderwell looked on, sad and silent. Mr. Plymdale settled his cravat uneasily. Right, that's the reading done. Now, let's discuss all the different things that are going on in here. If we look first at page 181 and 82, the first two pages, there is so much going on. We've got gentlemen, first of all, two very important gentlemen, and they are the physicians, Sprague and Minchin. And it's interesting that the first thing that Eliot's narrator wants us to know is that these two men are normally opposed in a number of different opinions, but they can be made unanimous. They can work together when they see a common cause. And in this case, they do see a common cause. But let's talk about their differences, because it's interesting how they're contrasted with each other. One man seems very practical, pragmatic, concrete, not given to a lot of academics or abstractions, whereas the other, you could say, is a little bit more intellectual. But when I say intellectual in the sense that he knows what is acceptable intellectually for the time, what is considered highly intelligent. He's not necessarily into innovation. He's into things that have been accepted over time as what intelligent men should be reading and be able to repeat if necessary. And he has all that information to hand. And the thing I want to point out is this phrase that Eliot's narrator uses, where she talks about an old world association of cleverness with the evil principle. This goes a long way back, and I think it is a spirit that has been carried across the Atlantic with the various Protestant groups that had to flee England to escape persecution and set up colonies on the eastern seaboard. There is this idea of anti-intellectualism, and I'm going to talk about it in terms of the 17th century, because you know Middlemarch loves the 17th century, but that is where this attitude started. And I'm reading from an article by Leo F. Salt, who taught at Indiana University, and he's talking about the preachers who gave sermons to the Cromwell's New Model Army when they were fighting against Charles I. And he says here, the preachers of the New Model Army during the 1640s and 1650s engaged in a three-pronged attack upon the educated people of England, i.e. upon the clergy, the university teachers, and the lawyers. Both the levelers and the diggers, these were non-conforming groups during that time, gave strong support to this anti-professional or anti-intellectual point of view. And that spirit carried on into the 19th century, where in the early 19th century in England, there was a religious revival, and a lot of groups began to look back again at more Calvinist ideas, and we'll talk about those a little later. Here I'm going to read an article about Victorian anti-intellectualism. You'll have links to all of this in the description box, by the way, if you do want to look up. They're all JSTOR articles, of course. Please go get a free JSTOR subscription. It's fantastic if you want to do research into some of the recognized 19th century novels. There's loads of material. But in this article, it says, when Mill spoke in 1835 of the celebrity of England resting on her docks, her canals, and her railroads, he added, in intellect she is distinguished only for a kind of sober good sense, and for doing all those things which are best done where man most resembles a machine with the precision of a machine. And then it says, as late as 1850, and this is according to Huxley, practical men still, quote, believed that the idol whom they worship, rule of thumb, has been the source of the past prosperity and will suffice for the future welfare of the arts and manufactures. They were of opinion that science is speculative rubbish, that theory and practice have nothing to do with one another, and that the scientific habit of mind is an impediment rather than an aid in the conduct of ordinary affairs. Now that is interesting. So that anti-intellectualism bled into 19th century regard in some cases for new scientific knowledge. It liked things more practical, more down to earth, what had been accepted over time. And this is the background that is infecting, if you like, to use that word as a metaphor when we're talking about the physicians Sprague and Minchin. They were men who, yes, had learning, but nevertheless, they were infected by this idea that whatever they had as learning had to go back a ways. What was new was a little bit suspect. And I should divert as well, because Dr. Sprague is compared to a Lord Chancellor, isn't he? It says the doctor was more than suspected of having no religion, but somehow Middlemarch tolerated this deficiency as if he had been a Lord Chancellor. Now, the Lord Chancellor is an office in England. If you come from the UK, this is going to be a bit boring. So this is for everybody else. The Lord Chancellor is an old office in England. It's one of the oldest in parliamentary history and is thought to be around 1400 years old. I'm reading now from the UK government website, which explains a little of the history. It said for most of its history, that is of the Lord Chancellor's role, it combined legislative, executive, and judicial functions and was one of the most important political offices in the country. Originally Lord Chancellors were medieval secretaries to the monarch of the time. They were responsible for the supervision, preparation, and dispatch of all the king's letters, and that was how he would communicate with all his subjects. This entailed using, of course, the sovereign seal, right, the great seal of the realm, which came to symbolize the office. So the office of Lord Chancellor is associated with the royal seal. Over time, then the Lord Chancellor took on further administrative and judicial functions on behalf of the king. For example, the Lord Chancellor would preside over Parliament if the king could not be there himself. And so by the 13th century, the Lord Chancellor had become effectively the most senior judge in the land apart from the king himself. So you could see it's by using this comparison to the Lord Chancellor meant that we're talking about a person in a position above all other things. That is, they had carried so much authority and weight that it's irrelevant what they actually believe in. And so Dr. Sprague's great, unquestionable authority is put alongside Dr. Minchin, who has to function a little differently, and he does so by being very open and careful not to commit himself to any religious opinion, but to welcome them all. And so it says that when Bulstrode gets excited about the Lutheran doctrine of justification, Minchin doesn't go so far as to agree with him absolutely, but kind of makes sure he says that, well, I do think men are something more special, something a little bit different than other creatures. That's the closest he's going to come. He is not going to absolutely agree with Bulstrode on a point of doctrine. And we could discuss the Lutheran doctrine of justification if you wanted. I do feel that this is a point of Christian doctrine which is a little bit like discussing angels on the head of a pin. This business of, when you are saved by grace, by the grace of God because of the death of Jesus, what good actions you do, what part do they play in your justification? And there's been a lot of arguing back and forth within Christianity about what role your good actions play. If they don't play a role in your salvation at all, then what do you do them for? There's all kinds of different approaches to this. They get a little bit hair splitting, and I've always found them just a tiny bit different. When I was Christian, I found this whole argument rather boring. I just thought, why do we even have to? I suppose because some people thought they could get a good scorecard with God. If they thought there was some justification by their works, then they could, if you had power and money, you could do a lot more good things for other people than if you did not. And so perhaps there were people hoping, but to be honest, I think the point was to counter the Catholic idea that you could purchase greater status. You could purchase your way out of purgatory or do actions to work your way or a relative's way out of purgatory into heaven. And I think the Lutheran doctrine of justification just said, no, stop all this. You are saved by God's actions, not yours. All right. We underline that. Okay. Now we can talk about what use or what purpose your good actions serve otherwise. So I think that was the point of that. I hope I haven't gone on too long. Is everybody still with me? Yeah. Okay. We're going to carry on, talk about some other things. We're going to mention the Unitarians because Unitarianism goes back a long way, and it didn't originate in England. I understand it originated in Eastern Europe, but the ideas became interesting to Englishmen again during the Civil War. And then subsequently, men who crossed the Atlantic Ocean into America continued but also developed on Unitarian beliefs. But if we get back down to sort of the basicness of it, Unitarianism went a little further, I suppose, than Luther, whereas Luther had particular things about Catholic doctrine that he disagreed with. Unitarianism kind of threw the whole baby in bathwater out and said there's no Trinity. Jesus was not God, he was a man, and we're just going to start right from ground level now and base our faith on rationality. And many Unitarians prior to the 19th century were martyred for those beliefs. As you can imagine, they were blasphemous at that time. 19th century Unitarians, I think they were sort of tolerated, probably not by men like Bulstrode, who must have thought they were absolutely abominable. But within the 19th century, they were permitted their beliefs. And so Dr. Minchin, when he met a Unitarian, quite different than Mr. Bulstrode. So what the text is showing is that it didn't matter what kind of person with what kind of religious beliefs you put in Dr. Minchin's company, he would find a way to appear agreeable to both of them. And with Mr. Bulstrode, he kind of had to work at it because Mrs. Bulstrode was Dr. Minchin's patient. Hello, BookTube. This is a clip being recorded the day after the clips you've previously seen. And it was made while I was editing, because it's while I was editing the clips that I realized I left something out that was quite important in this section where we're talking about Dr. Minchin, because Dr. Minchin, when he meets the Unitarian brewer, and the Unitarian brewer speaks against the Athanasian Creed, and I think I didn't mention there that creed, of course, focused on belief in the Trinity and in the incarnation of God as man in Jesus. So in other words, what most Christian churches would expect their believers to have as basic beliefs. A Unitarian who had discarded the beliefs about Trinity and the incarnation of God as man would make fun of the Athanasian Creed or speak disparagingly of it. And of course, it says that Dr. Minchin, in his response to such a comment, would quote from Alexander Pope and his essay on man. And you must think, well, why on earth would he do that? And it is ironic because Alexander Pope was a Catholic. So we've come full circle now. We've gone Catholic, Lutheran, Unitarian, and back to Catholic again. However, Alexander Pope nevertheless explored issues of faith, and I have not read the whole of the essay on man, but there is a famous quote, perhaps what Dr. Minchin quoted to the Unitarian brewer. He might have said, "Know then thyself, presume not God to scan, the proper study of mankind is man." In other words, saying, don't over-exert yourself in trying to understand God. That is a waste of human intellectual time, maybe implying it's an impossible subject. So just don't go there. Leave it alone. The proper study of mankind is man. In other words, what you ought to be spending your time on. And it's interesting that Pope, of course, wrote during the 18th century when European minds were beginning to think that they needed to focus more on man and on the natural world that he inhabited to understand it better, that this might be a greater key to knowledge than continuing to focus on scriptures and on religious doctrine as the sole source of authoritative knowledge. And Pope seemed to be backing this up, but I just found it ironic that Pope, of course, was a Catholic. And so it was clear that even amongst Catholics, there was this capacity for questioning and looking for new knowledge. Catholicism wasn't necessarily what was holding up the acquisition of knowledge, nor was any particular faith, although it could be. Perhaps what Eliot's narrator is saying, and I think this would be in line with Eliot's own beliefs, was that Calvinistic Protestantism at its most strict and restrictive perhaps stood in the way of intellectual progress. We shall see if the text of Middlemarch bears that out in any way going forward. That's it, everyone. Back to the regularly scheduled clips. Now, page 182, I'm posting a section of it up again. These sections in yellow and brown that I've underlined are where members of the directors are talking specifically about Mr. Bulstrode without saying Mr. Bulstrode's name. And I find them quite amusing to say they were ready to combine against all innovators and against non-professionals given to interference. That is talking about Bulstrode. He is not a medical man, but he is trying hard to interfere in terms of decisions made about the hospital, and they don't think he ought to. And further down, it said Dr. Minchin shared fully in the new pique against Bulstrode. Okay, there they do name him. Excited by his apparent determination to patronize Lidgett. So unfortunately, you can also see amongst the directors that they're almost not seeing any difference. You could say Bulstrode, Lidgett, they're going to think the same thing about the two of them because they see the two as linked. And then later on in page 182, you get Mr. Wrench and Mr. Toller, the two apothecaries who are lower than the physicians, but they're the ones probably dispensing drugs to those people who couldn't afford a physician, but they could afford to ask the apothecary if they had something to treat an illness, and provided they had the money to pay for the drugs, that was usually cheaper than consulting a physician. And so those two men really don't like Dr. Lidgett at all. And why? That's because they say that Lidgett is not dispensing drugs. And that is weird because he's doing something a little bit different than a general practitioner should do. He's putting himself in weird places, because if he were a physician, of course he would not dispense drugs. But he's not a physician, he's a surgeon, so he should dispense them. But by refusing to do that and still wanting to be a general practitioner, he's just messing up the hierarchy that we've talked about in previous discussions, haven't we, of physician, surgeon, apothecary, each with their own special roles, and of course each with their own social economic status as well to go with it, and their place in the English class system, which none of these other directors really want anything to move or change in that. And they sense in Lidgett, here's a troublemaker, he's going to shift all the boundaries around. And it's these two apothecaries that use a term that has fallen out of use in English, jackanapes. The Oxford English Dictionary says that the earliest use of the term, and that's not necessarily its earliest spoken usage, just its earliest written appearance, is about 1450. But allegedly, this is a contemptuous name that was given to a 15th century Duke of Suffolk, the first Duke of Suffolk, by the way, William de la Pole. Now, his heraldic badge, and we should talk about that. Heraldic badges were bits of embroidery that could be sewn onto sashes over armor, and you could use that identified your family. Now, his particular heraldic badge was what was called an ape's clog. And I'm going to put a picture up here on screen because you're going to be like, oh, what? Now, this horrible little piece of equipment was, if you had a captive ape or gorilla that you brought over from Africa, you would keep it on a chain, unfortunately, and to keep it from leaping around with that chain, and because you would still be able, the animal would still be able to injure someone, you attached this jackanape, an ape's weight, a clog, and that weighed down the chain so that the poor trapped animal, I'm sorry if this is disturbing anyone, the poor trapped animal would also be limited in how quickly or how dramatically it could move. And so the term began to mean someone who wasn't very bright, or someone who was tied down to someone else, very servile, just doing what they were told and not having any mind or opinions of their own. On page 183, of course, we see so many new characters introduced that we haven't met before. In addition to Sprague and Minchin, of course, we suddenly have Mr. Powderell, the retired ironmonger. We have Mr. Hackbutt, a very rich tanner, a man who is very well spoken and likes to speak. And obviously the rest of the directors have realized that if you don't interrupt Mr. Hackbutt, he never stops talking. So they have done so. But of course, they also describe Mr. Hackbutt in a lovely way. They talk about his glittering spectacles and his erect hair. Now, I can imagine some people going, I beg, what? Was he got a mohawk or something? I mean, you're thinking, surely not in the 19th century. Well, in this part of the 19th century, from about the 1830s to the 1850s and 60s, the fashion among men was to always wear one of those tall beaver felt hats. And naturally, those tended to smash your hair down after a while. So what men had to do, because curly hair was also in fashion, it was very fashionable to have curls, right? I'll just, good thing, right? They didn't have to have straight hair. So I would have been all right, although the hat would have been an issue. But what gentlemen did was, in order to be able to show off their curls and at the same time wear this silly hat that would crush them, you either had to comb your hair flat on top and allow your curls to sort of spread out on either side of your head, or you had to, with various, I don't know what sort of unguents they used, you had to comb and fluff your hair in sort of an upward column. And I'm going to put some pictures on screen now which show drawings that have examples of this. That must have been the weirdest hair to look at. Ever so glad that those hats went out of fashion. Well, that and for the beavers as well, which were losing their fur in incredible numbers. And again, on this page, you have some more yellow and brown sections where people are talking about Bulstrode without quite talking about Bulstrode. It behooves us as directors to consider whether we will regard it as our whole business to carry out propositions emanating from a single quarter. Well, that single quarter is Bulstrode, and it might include Lidgett. It's said that they identify Bulstrode with Lidgett with Bulstrode. Can't tell them apart. Might as well just have one name. And again, Hackbutt says, by parties whose disposition it is to regard every institution of this town as a machinery for carrying out their own views. That's definitely talking about Bulstrode again. So there isn't a lot of warm feeling for Bulstrode. There's really only a couple of people that are allying themselves to him. Mr. Plymdale and Mr. Frank Hawley, they're on opposite sides. One's for Tyke, one's for Fairbrother. So we're just starting to get to see how the voting is going to fall. And this is all before Lidgett or Bulstrode show up. So all quite interesting. And of course, Dr. Minchin wants everyone to know that really he had terrible time deciding. But of course, he's going to come down in the end to Mr. Fairbrother, and he quotes tradition. Time spent. He says that he wants Mr. Fairbrother because he's an able preacher, but more important, has been longer among us. That really matters. From Minchin and Sprague, it's about what the past has established. Never mind the future and all these newfangled things. What has been established in the past. And that, dear Middlemarch meditation watchers, is where we're going to leave off. We do have a few more pages left in this chapter which cover the vote, and they are also interesting dramatically. But I thought, well, we'll cover that, and then we get a clean start in August, because in August, believe it or not, we're going to go back and talk about Dorothea Brooke, who is now Dorothea Casaubon, and catch up with her and find out what has life been like since she got married. Very excited about that, but that's for August, everyone. If you don't die in a heat wave between now and then, I'll look forward to seeing you then. Okay, everybody, take care in the meantime. Bye-bye.